Sometimes the 5 quietest words can change a person's entire life. The sentence had not yet been spoken aloud, but on a cool autumn morning outside the Jefferson Federal Courthouse in Virginia, its meaning was already waiting to unfold. The courthouse stood beneath a bright blue sky as attorneys hurried across the granite plaza carrying leather briefcases. Deputy marshals greeted familiar faces with polite nods, and courthouse employees moved through the revolving doors with the confidence of another ordinary workday. Nothing about the morning suggested that one brief conversation would quietly transform the way dozens of people understood justice before the sun began to set. Officer Daniel Walker adjusted the radio clipped to his uniform as he surveyed the entrance. 17 years in law enforcement had convinced him that experience could identify trouble long before paperwork ever confirmed it. He trusted quick judgments because they had rarely been questioned, and every successful day reinforced the belief that instinct deserved the same respect as evidence. As visitors approached the security checkpoint, Daniel examined each face with practiced confidence until one man immediately drew his attention. A tall black man wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit walked steadily toward the courthouse carrying a slim leather briefcase. His polished shoes echoed softly across the stone walkway, yet there was nothing hurried about his pace. His posture reflected quiet discipline rather than self-importance, and his calm expression suggested someone completely at peace with where he was going. Daniel stepped directly into his path before the man reached the entrance. "Good morning," Daniel said firmly. "I need to know your business inside this courthouse." The man stopped without hesitation. He met the officer's eyes with remarkable calm before answering in a measured voice. "I have official business that begins shortly." Daniel folded his arms. "What kind of official business?" The man glanced briefly toward the courthouse clock mounted above the entrance. "The kind that will explain itself when the proper time arrives." Daniel frowned. "That is not how verification works." The man simply nodded. "Verification is important." "I completely agree." His willingness to cooperate should have eased the conversation, yet somehow it only deepened Daniel's suspicion. Several attorneys walking toward the entrance slowed their pace for just a moment before continuing inside. A courthouse clerk looked toward the exchange, recognized neither urgency nor conflict, and quietly disappeared through the security doors. The man never showed the slightest sign of frustration. He stood patiently beside his leather briefcase, waiting as though every passing second carried its own purpose. Daniel interpreted that calmness as confidence without justification. "Until I know exactly who you are staying right here," he said. The man smiled gently, not with arrogance, but with the quiet certainty of someone who understood something the officer did not. He adjusted the handle of his briefcase and looked directly at Daniel. "That is your decision, officer." Daniel waited for an argument that never came. Instead, the man spoke only 5 simple words. "See you in court." Daniel gave a short laugh. "Is that supposed to impress me?" The man's smile never faded. "No," he answered softly. "It is simply where the truth has a way of arriving." The words lingered in the crisp morning air long after the conversation ended. Daniel dismissed them as little more than confidence from someone trying to sound important. He never noticed the black government sedan quietly parking across the street. He never noticed 2 uniformed military officers entering through a side entrance carrying sealed document cases. He never noticed several legal professionals briefly looking toward the quiet man before continuing inside. His attention remained fixed entirely on the stranger standing patiently before him, completely unaware that every minute passing outside the courthouse was bringing them both closer to the place where those 5 quiet words would soon carry more meaning than anyone present could possibly imagine. Officer Daniel Walker remained standing between the courthouse entrance and the quiet man carrying the leather briefcase, convinced that every additional question brought him closer to confirming his first impression. Around them, the morning continued with its familiar rhythm as attorneys exchanged greetings, deputy marshals welcomed scheduled witnesses, and courthouse employees disappeared behind the heavy glass doors without realizing that a far more important lesson was quietly unfolding only a few feet away. The black man waiting calmly before him never appeared impatient. His breathing remained steady, his posture relaxed, and his attention rested completely on the officer speaking to him. Daniel found the composure unsettling. During nearly 2 decades in uniform, He had grown accustomed to people becoming nervous when questioned. Some argued. Others hurried to explain themselves. A few complained about delays. The man before him did none of those things. "I asked you who you were meeting," Daniel said. "You still have not answered." The man smiled politely. "I answered as completely as I am permitted to answer at this moment." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "Permitted by whom?" The response came without hesitation. "By the responsibilities I accepted long before I arrived here today." The answer sounded respectful, yet it revealed almost nothing. Daniel interpreted that as deliberate avoidance instead of disciplined restraint. He reached for his radio and quietly requested additional verification through courthouse security while keeping his attention fixed on the man standing before him. Several people walking into the courthouse slowed just enough to observe the conversation before continuing inside. A pair of young attorneys exchanged curious glances. An older deputy clerk paused for a brief moment after looking toward the man with the leather briefcase, almost as though she recognized him. But another employee called her name before she could speak, and she continued into the building without interrupting the exchange. Across the street, another dark government vehicle pulled into a reserved parking space. A uniformed military officer stepped out carrying a sealed document case and entered through a side entrance reserved for authorized personnel. Moments later, two professionally dressed government attorneys followed through separate security lanes, each carrying identical black portfolios. None of them acknowledged the man waiting outside, yet each briefly glanced toward the courthouse clock before disappearing inside. Daniel noticed none of it. His attention remained fixed entirely on proving that his instincts were correct. "You seem unusually comfortable standing here," Daniel observed. The man nodded slightly. "Patience becomes easier when you trust the process." Daniel folded his arms once again. "Most people would be frustrated by now." "Perhaps," the man replied gently. "But frustration rarely improves judgment." The words settled quietly between them. Daniel considered them another carefully chosen attempt to sound important, while the man simply spoke from experience. A cool breeze moved across the courthouse plaza, carrying with it the distant sound of church bells marking the passing quarter hour. The man lifted his eyes toward the courthouse clock once again before returning his attention to Daniel. "You keep looking at that clock," Daniel said. "Are you waiting for someone?" A faint smile appeared once more. "No, officer. I am waiting for the right moment." Daniel gave a skeptical shake of his head. "Moments do not change facts." The man answered with quiet certainty. "No, they reveal them." The reply lingered in Daniel's thoughts longer than he expected, even though he refused to admit it. Around them, the courthouse continued preparing for a proceeding unlike any other scheduled that morning. While every passing minute quietly brought the patient stranger and the confident officer closer to a courtroom where assumptions would no longer carry any authority, and only verified truth would be allowed to speak. Officer Daniel Walker lowered his radio after receiving confirmation that courthouse security had found nothing immediately disqualifying about the quiet visitor, yet the response only strengthened his determination to continue asking questions himself. Experience had taught him to believe that official records could miss details while personal instincts rarely did. Standing only a few feet away, the tall black man remained, perfectly composed, one hand resting lightly on the handle of his slim leather briefcase. His attention focused not on the growing number of curious onlookers, but on the officer standing before him. "You still have not explained why your arrival seems so carefully timed," Daniel said. The man answered with the same measured voice that had never once risen in frustration. "Every important responsibility begins at a specific time, officer. Mine is no different." Daniel studied his face, searching for hesitation that never appeared. "Then tell me who is expecting you." The man paused briefly before replying. "The people who need to know already know." The answer sounded simple, yet it offered Daniel nothing he considered useful. Around them, the courthouse plaza continued filling with professionals beginning another ordinary day. Attorneys carrying thick case binders crossed the granite walkway. Court reporters entered through the security checkpoint with rolling bags full of equipment. A maintenance employee quietly polished the brass rail near the entrance, barely glancing toward the conversation before returning to work. Everything looked ordinary, but small details quietly continued collecting around the patient stranger. A dark government sedan parked beside the reserved entrance. Two military legal officers stepped out wearing service uniforms beneath neatly pressed overcoats. Neither approached the man. Neither acknowledged him publicly. Instead, both entered through a restricted doorway after briefly checking the courthouse clock. Moments later, another vehicle arrived carrying federal attorneys who exchanged respectful greetings with courthouse personnel before disappearing inside. Daniel never connected those separate moments. His attention remained fixed on proving that his first impression had been correct. Most people would become impatient by now, Daniel observed. You seem almost comfortable waiting. The man smiled gently. Patience becomes easier when you understand that truth does not arrive faster because someone demands it. Daniel folded his arms. You speak like someone who believes this conversation does not matter. The answer came. Immediately. Every conversation matters. Especially the first one. Those words lingered in Daniel's thoughts longer than he expected. Before he could respond, a courthouse employee hurried toward the entrance carrying several sealed document envelopes. She looked briefly toward the waiting man, offered the smallest respectful nod, then continued inside without saying a word. Daniel noticed the gesture but dismissed it as coincidence. He had already decided that confidence without explanation deserved closer scrutiny. The man, however, appeared completely unconcerned with how much time had passed. He looked once more toward the large courthouse clock as another minute quietly disappeared. The faint smile returned to his face. You keep watching that clock, Daniel said. Does it tell you something I do not know? The man answered with quiet certainty. It reminds me that every process has its moment. Daniel shook his head. You really believe everything will make sense inside that building? The man met his eyes without the slightest trace of arrogance. I do not believe it, officer. I know it. The breeze carried the sound of the courthouse bell across the plaza as more visitors entered through the security checkpoint. None of them realized that every passing minute was drawing closer to a courtroom where titles would be formally announced, identities would be properly recognized, and one calm promise spoken outside the courthouse would soon become the most unforgettable truth anyone in that room would hear. The atmosphere outside the Jefferson Federal Courthouse changed so quietly that almost no one recognized the turning point as it arrived. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontation, and no urgent movement across the granite plaza. Instead, the ordinary business of justice continued exactly as it did every weekday morning, while countless small details began fitting together like pieces of a puzzle that only one person already understood. Officer Daniel Walker remained convinced that caution justified every decision he had made since stopping the quiet visitor at the entrance. He watched the black man carefully, expecting impatience to appear. Sooner or later. Instead, the opposite happened. The longer the delay continued, the more composed the visitor seemed to become. You have had every opportunity to explain yourself, Daniel said. Yet you continue giving answers that avoid the question. The man regarded him calmly. Sometimes the complete answer belongs in the proper place, not the earliest moment. Daniel frowned. The proper place is right here. The visitor gently shook his head. Respectfully, officer, it is not. Another silence settled between them. Nearby, a courthouse employee carrying several sealed case folders slowed for only a second after recognizing the man standing outside. She appeared ready to greet him before quietly deciding against it, offering only the smallest respectful nod as she continued through the security entrance. Daniel noticed the gesture but dismissed it without another thought. To him, it looked like ordinary professional courtesy. To the visitor, it simply confirmed that everyone involved continued following the established procedure exactly as planned. Across the street, another government vehicle arrived and parked in a reserved space. A senior military legal officer stepped out carrying a locked document case, briefly checked the courthouse clock, then disappeared through a restricted entrance without speaking to anyone waiting outside. Within moments, two additional federal attorneys entered through separate security lanes carrying matching black portfolios. None of them acknowledged the visitor publicly, yet each looked toward him for only an instant before continuing inside. Their restraint was deliberate, though Daniel failed to recognize its significance. His attention remained fixed on proving that his instincts had been correct from the beginning. You seem unusually certain this delay does not matter, Daniel observed. The visitor smiled politely. Every important responsibility teaches patience. And every responsible officer verifies facts, Daniel replied. Then we agree on something, the man answered. Facts deserve to arrive before conclusions. Those words lingered in the cool morning air. Daniel looked toward the leather briefcase resting beside the visitor's polished shoes. What is inside that case? He asked. Official documents. Can I see them? The visitor paused before answering. They are intended to be opened only through the proper judicial procedure. Daniel interpreted the response as another refusal, although the man's voice remained respectful from beginning to end. A gentle breeze moved across the courthouse plaza as the large clock above the entrance advanced another minute. The visitor lifted his eyes toward it once more, not with anxiety, but with quiet confidence. Everything continued unfolding exactly on schedule. More courthouse staff disappeared behind the heavy glass doors. More attorneys gathered inside. More sealed files reached their assigned courtrooms. Every unnoticed detail quietly prepared the moment when hidden authority would finally become visible through lawful procedure instead of personal announcement. Standing only a few feet apart, the two men were looking at the same courthouse, the same clock, and the same morning, yet they saw entirely different realities. Daniel believed he was preventing uncertainty from entering the building. The visitor knew uncertainty would disappear forever the moment the courtroom doors opened, because truth had never needed permission to exist. It only needed the proper time to be recognized. 4 days earlier, inside a secure conference room at the Office of Military Commissions, the atmosphere reflected the same discipline that guided every military courtroom across the country. There were no unnecessary conversations, no dramatic speeches, and no effort to impress anyone in the room. Every person present understood that justice depended upon preparation long before a hearing ever began. A digital briefing screen displayed the schedule for a joint judicial proceeding involving both federal and military legal authorities. At the center of the agenda appeared one assignment that required absolute confidentiality until the official opening of the hearing. Colonel Marcus Ellison reviewed the briefing documents with quiet concentration while several senior legal officers finalized procedural details. One officer closed the presentation before speaking to everyone gathered around the conference table. This proceeding will follow standard judicial protocol. Public identification of assigned judicial authorities will occur only after the court officially convenes. Marcus acknowledged the instruction with a simple nod. Understood. He asked no questions because the procedure required no explanation. Throughout his career, he had learned that genuine authority never depended upon announcing itself ahead of time. It revealed itself through the lawful process established to protect every participant equally. The official credentials, judicial appointment orders, and sealed case materials were carefully placed inside a slim leather briefcase identical to the one he now carried outside the Jefferson Federal Courthouse. Before the meeting ended, another senior officer quietly reminded him that the integrity of the proceeding depended upon every participant respecting the established sequence of events. Marcus accepted the responsibility without hesitation. During the following days, federal court administrators, military legal officers, deputy marshals, and government attorneys coordinated arrival times, courtroom assignments, and document transfers with careful precision. Every schedule matched the next. Every participant understood exactly where to be and when to arrive. Marcus declined the offer of a dedicated military escort to the courtroom, explaining that he preferred to enter through the same public entrance used by every citizen appearing before the court. His decision reflected a belief he had carried throughout his legal career. Respect for the law begins by trusting the same lawful process that protects everyone else. Back in the present, Marcus remained standing patiently outside the courthouse exactly where Officer Daniel Walker had asked him to wait. The leather briefcase rested beside him, still unopened. Daniel looked toward it once more, wondering why someone carrying official documents appeared so comfortable allowing valuable time to pass. Marcus understood something Daniel did not. The documents inside the briefcase had never been intended to answer questions on the courthouse steps. Their proper place was inside the courtroom, presented through official judicial procedure rather than personal explanation. Across the plaza, another government vehicle quietly entered the reserved parking area. A military legal administrator stepped out carrying a secured document pouch before disappearing through an authorized entrance. Nearby, Two assistant United States attorneys compared notes while checking the courthouse clock, then continued towards separate courtrooms according to schedule. Every arrival followed the carefully coordinated plan established days earlier. Marcus briefly looked toward the courthouse clock once again. Only a few minutes remained before the proceeding would officially begin. His calm expression never changed because he understood that truth never needed to rush ahead of the process designed to reveal it. Daniel interpreted the quiet confidence as unexplained certainty, unaware that every passing minute was bringing them closer to the exact moment when protocol, patience, and the rule of law would quietly transform every assumption made outside the courthouse into an unforgettable lesson inside the courtroom. The courthouse clock quietly reached the appointed hour, and almost at the same moment, Officer Daniel Walker received a brief message through his radio. A courthouse supervisor instructed him to escort the waiting visitor inside so that the final judicial procedures could begin without further delay. Daniel acknowledged the instruction with quiet confidence. In his mind, the next few minutes would simply complete the verification process he believed had justified every decision he had made that morning. "Bring your briefcase," Daniel said. "You are coming with me." The tall black man answered with the same calm courtesy he had shown since the beginning of their conversation. "Thank you, officer." He lifted the slim leather briefcase from the granite bench and followed Daniel through the heavy glass doors of the Jefferson Federal Courthouse. The polished marble floors reflected the morning sunlight pouring through the tall windows, while courthouse employees moved with quiet efficiency from one hallway to another. Attorneys organized case files, deputy marshals confirmed courtroom assignments, and court clerks carried neatly arranged document folders toward their scheduled proceedings. The building seemed completely ordinary, yet there was an unmistakable sense that an important hearing was about to begin. Daniel walked several steps ahead, believing he remained firmly in control of the situation. Behind him, the visitor moved with unhurried confidence, occasionally acknowledging courthouse employees with polite nods. More than one employee returned the greeting with subtle respect, but no one interrupted the process. Every person appeared committed to allowing established courtroom procedure to unfold naturally. As they approached courtroom 3, two uniformed military legal officers stood quietly near the entrance speaking with Assistant United States Attorney Ethan Brooks. The conversation stopped for only a moment as the visitor approached. Both officers instinctively straightened their posture before respectfully stepping aside to clear the hallway. Daniel noticed the movement, but assumed it reflected ordinary courtroom protocol rather than recognition of the man walking beside him. "Please wait here," Daniel instructed. "The courtroom deputy will complete the remaining verification." The visitor stopped exactly where requested. "Certainly." His voice remained calm, neither impatient nor defensive. Moments later, Ethan Brooks stepped into the hallway carrying a thick case binder. He looked briefly toward the visitor before offering a courteous nod that seemed almost instinctive. "Good morning," he said warmly before continuing into the courtroom. Daniel watched the brief exchange with growing curiosity. The greeting suggested familiarity, yet no explanation followed. Before he could ask another question, the courtroom deputy opened the large wooden doors and announced that all participants should prepare for the opening of the proceeding. Inside the courtroom, attorneys quietly took their assigned seats while military officers arranged themselves according to protocol. Court reporters checked their equipment, clerks organized official records, and the atmosphere settled into complete silence. Daniel remained near the rear entrance, still waiting for the final confirmation he believed would explain everything. The visitor looked toward the empty judicial bench at the front of the courtroom for only a moment before returning his attention to Daniel. A faint smile appeared once again, exactly the same calm smile that had puzzled the officer since their first conversation outside. "Officer," the visitor said gently, "thank you for allowing the process to continue." Daniel looked at him with quiet confusion. "I still do not know who you are." The visitor answered without hesitation. "In just a few moments, everyone in this room will know." At that exact instant, the courtroom deputy called for all attendees to rise. Every conversation immediately ceased, and the heavy doors leading to the judicial chambers slowly opened, signaling that the moment the visitor had patiently awaited all morning had finally arrived. Every person inside courtroom 3 remained standing as silence settled across the room with remarkable precision. The courtroom deputy looked toward the entrance from the judicial chambers and announced in a clear voice, "The court recognizes the arrival of the assigned military judicial authority." No one hurried. No one spoke. The only sound came from measured footsteps echoing across the polished floor. The tall black man who had patiently waited outside the courthouse all morning walked forward carrying the same slim leather briefcase that had remained closed since Officer Daniel Walker first stopped him at the entrance. Daniel watched in complete disbelief as two senior military legal officers immediately stepped aside with unmistakable professional respect. Assistant United States Attorney Ethan Brooks closed the folder in his hands and stood quietly beside counsel table. Judge Rebecca Collins inclined her head before addressing the courtroom. The court formally recognizes Colonel Marcus Ellison, military judge assigned to today's joint judicial proceeding. The courtroom remained perfectly still. Daniel felt every conversation from the courthouse entrance replay inside his memory with extraordinary clarity. Every answer Marcus had given suddenly carried a completely different meaning. He had never refused cooperation. He had never attempted to misuse authority. He had never once argued or demanded special treatment. Instead, he had trusted that the proper courtroom procedure would reveal everything at the appropriate moment. Marcus calmly placed his leather briefcase on the designated judicial table and presented his official credentials through the courtroom clerk exactly as required by protocol. The clerk carefully verified the appointment orders before returning them with professional courtesy. Judge Collins confirmed the assignment for the official record, and the proceeding continued according to the same lawful process that had been planned days earlier. Nothing about the reveal depended upon emotion or dramatic declarations. It depended entirely upon verified documentation, established procedure, and respect for the rule of law. Daniel remained near the rear of the courtroom, unable to ignore the quiet realization settling over him. The government vehicles arriving throughout the morning suddenly made sense. The military officers carrying sealed document cases. The respectful glances from courthouse employees. The attorneys who seemed to recognize Marcus without interrupting the process. Even the repeated looks toward the courthouse clock now formed one complete picture. Every detail had been connected from the beginning. Daniel simply had not possessed enough information to understand it. Marcus briefly looked toward him. There was no satisfaction in his expression, no disappointment, no anger, only the same calm professionalism that had defined every moment since sunrise. Judge Collins then addressed everyone present. This courtroom exists for one purpose. Facts receive their proper place before conclusions receive their authority. Every individual who enters these proceedings deserves equal dignity until the complete truth is established. The words settled deeply across the courtroom. Several attorneys quietly nodded while court staff continued organizing official records. Marcus took his assigned place with composed confidence, prepared to fulfill the responsibility entrusted to him rather than reflect on the misunderstanding outside. Daniel slowly lowered his eyes, recognizing that the greatest lesson of the morning had not come from a title, a rank, or a uniform. It had come from a man who never needed to announce his importance because genuine authority had spoken through patience, discipline, and lawful procedure. Only then did Daniel fully understand the quiet promise he had heard outside the courthouse. Those 5 simple words had never been intended as a warning. They had been an invitation to let justice reveal the truth in the only place where assumptions could no longer stand above facts. The courtroom settled into a steady rhythm as the proceeding moved forward, and with every passing minute it became increasingly clear that the most important lesson of the day had never been about status or authority. It had always been about the discipline to allow facts to speak before assumptions took their place. Colonel Marcus Ellison remained composed as official arguments were presented, carefully reviewing each document placed before him with the same patience he had demonstrated since arriving at the courthouse that morning. Nothing in his expression suggested resentment over what had happened outside. His responsibility now was exactly what it had been from the beginning, to ensure that every legal question before the court received fair consideration under established law. Judge Rebecca Collins looked across the courtroom before addressing everyone present. Every participant in these proceedings deserves equal respect, equal protection, and equal opportunity to be heard. The integrity of this court depends upon that principle. Her words carried unusual weight because nearly everyone in the room understood how easily appearances could influence judgment when complete information was still missing. Assistant United States Attorney Ethan Brooks continued presenting procedural matters while military legal counsel responded according to established courtroom practice. Every statement was supported by official records. Every exhibit was introduced through proper procedure. Every decision reflected the careful balance between federal law and military legal authority that had brought the two judicial systems together for this hearing. Officer Daniel Walker remained quietly near the rear of the courtroom, no longer watching Marcus with suspicion but with thoughtful reflection. His attention shifted away from the uniform he wore and toward the choices he had made. He remembered every question he had asked outside the courthouse. He remembered the calm answers he had dismissed because they did not match the conclusion he had already formed. Most of all, he remembered the quiet confidence with which Marcus had accepted every delay without anger or complaint. Daniel slowly understood that genuine professionalism is measured not by how quickly conclusions are reached, but by how carefully they are tested. During a brief procedural pause, Judge Collins addressed the courtroom once again. Justice begins long before a final ruling is announced. It begins with the willingness to treat every individual fairly before every fact has been uncovered. Several attorneys quietly nodded while court personnel continued organizing official records. The statement required no further explanation because the events of the morning had already illustrated its meaning more effectively than any lecture could. Marcus briefly looked toward Daniel. Their eyes met for only a moment. There was no trace of triumph in Marcus's expression, only quiet understanding. He offered the same respectful nod he had given outside the courthouse hours earlier, demonstrating that dignity does not change simply because circumstances do. Daniel returned the gesture with sincere respect, recognizing that the man standing before him had chosen grace instead of humiliation, professionalism instead of personal satisfaction. As the hearing approached its conclusion, official schedules were confirmed, future procedural dates were placed on the record, and court personnel carefully organized every document according to standard practice. The courtroom gradually returned to the familiar rhythm of daily judicial work. Yet the atmosphere felt noticeably different. Everyone present had witnessed more than a legal proceeding. They had witnessed the quiet power of patience, restraint, and lawful process overcoming assumption without anger. Inside those walls, authority had never depended upon appearance, rank, or recognition. It had depended upon integrity, accountability, and unwavering respect for the rule of law, reminding every person in the courtroom that true justice becomes strongest when dignity is offered before judgment and truth is allowed to arrive before conclusions are made. The courtroom deputy formally adjourned the proceeding, and the quiet echo of the gavel marked the end of a hearing that many people would remember for reasons far beyond the legal issues discussed that day. Attorneys carefully gathered their files, military legal officers exchanged brief professional conversations, and court personnel organized the official record with the same precision that had guided every step of the proceeding from the very beginning. Nothing about the conclusion suggested celebration. Justice had simply completed another day of faithful service. Colonel Marcus Ellison closed the slim leather briefcase that had remained at his side since arriving at the courthouse that morning. Inside were the same judicial credentials, official appointment orders, and legal documents that Officer Daniel Walker had unknowingly questioned only hours earlier. Marcus thanked Judge Rebecca Collins with a respectful nod before quietly greeting Assistant United States Attorney Ethan Brooks and several military legal officers waiting near the front of the courtroom. Their conversation focused only on future schedules, procedural responsibilities, and the continuing work that still lay ahead. Personal feelings never entered the discussion because every person present understood that the purpose of the court was never to elevate individuals. It was to uphold the law with fairness and consistency. Daniel remained standing near the rear entrance until nearly everyone had left the courtroom. He watched Marcus preparing to leave, then slowly walked forward. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. The silence no longer felt uncertain. It felt honest. Daniel finally looked directly at Marcus. "I believed I had enough information to make the right decision," he said quietly. "I understand now that I should have listened before reaching a conclusion." Marcus regarded him with the same calm expression he had carried throughout the entire day. Experience is valuable, he answered gently. It becomes wisdom only when it leaves room for the truth. Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment before offering a sincere nod. Thank you for your patience. Marcus extended his hand without hesitation. Daniel accepted it with genuine respect. The simple handshake lasted only a few seconds, yet it carried more meaning than any speech could have expressed. It was not about forgetting the morning. It was about choosing to move forward with a better understanding of the responsibility both men carried in different ways. As Marcus walked through the courthouse hallway, deputy marshals, attorneys, military officers, and courthouse employees acknowledged him with quiet professional respect. He returned every greeting with the same humility that had defined him from the first moment he stepped onto the courthouse plaza. Outside, the afternoon sunlight stretched across the granite steps where the day had begun. Marcus paused briefly before looking back toward the entrance. Earlier that morning, those steps had been filled with assumptions. Now they represented something entirely different. They reminded everyone who had witnessed the events that dignity should never depend upon appearance, profession, rank, or the color of a person's skin. Daniel emerged from the courthouse a few minutes later and looked across the same plaza where he had first stopped the quiet visitor. The scene appeared completely ordinary once again, yet nothing felt quite the same. He realized that wearing a badge demanded more than confidence. It demanded the humility to ask, the discipline to verify, and the courage to let evidence guide judgment instead of assumptions. Marcus placed the leather briefcase inside a waiting government vehicle before taking one final look at the courthouse. A quiet smile returned to his face because the promise he had made that morning had been fulfilled. Exactly as he knew it would be. Truth had arrived in the courtroom without anger, without revenge, and without raising its voice. As the vehicle disappeared into the afternoon traffic beneath the American flag, one lesson remained behind for everyone willing to remember it. Real authority does not announce itself. Real justice does not hurry itself. And real dignity belongs to every person long before the world discovers who they truly are.